Hello, thank you everyone for being here. We're very excited to have you join us today. To start today, and in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. And I pay my respects to the ancestors and their descendants. And today I'm on Chipukai land, which is rainforest land in the Barma country. So again, thank you for joining us today. And for those that haven't met me, I'm Beryl Morris, Director of TURN, Australia's Ecosystem Observatory. Please feel free to ask any questions today using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer the questions at the end of the talks. If you have any technical issues, put those into the chat line, and we'll see whether we can sort those out as we go along. At the end of the webinar, we have a little survey, which we hope you'll fill in so that we can find out how we can improve what we're offering to you. And we are recording today's webinar, so you can have a look at it again or send it to friends, etc. I'm so pleased with the turnout today. We have hundreds of people and we have them from across the world. Obviously, monitoring threatened species is something that does appeal to people anywhere that they occur. So just to quickly fill you in, our program TURN is part of the federal government's program for national research infrastructure. And TURN can only exist because we partner with so many different organisations across the country to be able to operate our infrastructure in so many different parts of this huge continent. Now I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. I think that you've already seen their bios in the registration, so I'm not going to say very much about them. I'm going to let you peruse that one as you wish. But we have three fantastic speakers. We have Dr. Ashley Leedman, who is from the newly named Australian Government Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. And Ashley's had a long association with threatened species, but more recently with making sure that there's a standard way of monitoring. We're looking forward to that. Following Ashley, we'll have Dr. Holly Sitters, who is from the Australian Wildlife Conservatory. And Holly is going to tell us what is happening in what is a very, very admirable group that is looking after conservation for us in Australia. And lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Jeff Hurd, who is from TURN, and he is the Program Manager for TURN's Threatened Species Index. But I'm going to now hand over to Ashley so that we can get underway with our talks. And I'll talk to you a little later. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everybody. Look, fantastic to be here. So my name is Dr. Ashley Leedman. I work for the newly named department. I work in an area in program delivery in the monitoring and evaluation space. So our area really does cover on-ground management of threatened species, on-ground interventions, Australian government led. And we are really working to sort of on that monitoring space to improve what we do. I don't really need to go over the state of play for threatened species. I think everyone on this talk is pretty familiar with the issues biodiversity faces in Australia with multiple threats, habitat loss and fragmentation, invasive species, altered fire regimes, climate change, really just to name a few. Each species will have its own threats and each area has its own particular issues. It's important to acknowledge that these causes of these threatened species declines are both historic and ongoing. Habitat fragmentation is largely an historic thing, and stopping it, you're not going to see immediate change. So there's that different things you need to manage. And I guess it's really important to acknowledge that monitoring, we acknowledge that monitoring of threatened species is inadequate to track change over time. We really don't have systems in place, and we really struggle to be able to understand what those changes are for those threatened species. So what I'm going to touch on in this presentation is really, I'll touch a little bit on threatened species listings, how species are listed. It's important to understand that sort of slightly hidden process, how they're listed, and really touch on the end what we're doing to improve monitoring of these species. To understand threatened species monitoring, or threatened species listing, you really have to understand, at least acknowledge, it all stems from the EPBC Act. This is my stained copy on the right from my species listing days. But before we even launch into what the Act says about threatened species listing, it's important to get a grasp of the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, which is really an independent committee. It's appointed by the Minister, but they're eminent conservation scientists with a background in various different parts of conservation science. And they advise the Minister on a number of things, but one of their key, or two of their key areas, is to advise the Minister on appropriate on species listings, what category species should be in, and on ecological communities and threatening processes. And they also advise on conservation and recovery planning for those species. So really, every threatened species that moves up for ministerial approval, like the greater glider the other day, that's come through a really rigorous process through the threatened species, through advice through the Threatened Species Scientific Committee. Fair to say the Minister does not have to, the Minister has to receive the advice and consider it, doesn't have to act on it. But in my long experience with this, pretty much whatever the Threatened Species Scientific Committee has recommended has gone through. So they're a really important body to understand how species listings work. When you get into species listing, the EPBC Act is a little thin on the criteria. So we have the criteria, as you can see from this slide, you've got your different criterion that species are listed under. So it's things like declines, geographic distribution, total number of mature individuals, those, then estimated total number and probability of extinction in the wild. They're the categories that the TSC judges on. And we've got critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. There's also categories that are extinct in the wild, and conservation dependent. While the Act isn't overly prescriptive on where these categories fit in, or the actual limits of them, once you explore further into it, they really, by using the IUCN criteria, you can get some pretty strict definitions. So this is just a species listing for one criterion for plains wanderers on the right, if anyone recognizes those little chicks. And what we do to list a species is go through all of these criteria. There's 5 criteria. Each criteria has a whole bunch of subcomponents, and then you've got numbers to match up. So we look at the latest scientific evidence. It's not always published, so we would go out to experts. We use whatever information sources are out there and make a considered argument, because as we've touched on, the monitoring is not brilliant for most of these species. So you really are constructing this argument, and the Threatened Species Scientific Committee then makes its recommendation on this category. You can see for the plains wanderer, it was eligible under 4 different categories. Its highest category is critically endangered, and so that's what plains wanderers got listed as. The process to get them there is a long one, and the whole listing process is a long process because it is considered. You have this nomination prioritisation phase. Public can nominate, but you also get nominations from states and territories and internal. So they can come from various places, or they can be prioritised through things like the Bird Action Plan is a good example, or the department's just finishing up a massive process to list or to reevaluate and to list, in some cases, species that were impacted by the Black Summer fires a few years ago. And so a lot of species, through this expert committee and through other panels, species came onto the threatened species, onto the nomination process through that. I've talked about this assessment and listing space, which is really where they consider the evidence, make recommendations. But they also, in that process, look at conservation advices and recovery plans. They will go through that process, and that feeds into investing in priority actions, which I'll touch on. It's an area that I work in now. But also another significant area is regulation through the EPBC Act for environmental approvals and assessments. So a listed species may well get conditions set on it when it's considering a development application. All feeds back around into monitoring and reporting, which goes back in through. Species are reassessed as required and as recommended. But once a species is listed, it remains listed until it's put back on the list for reassessment, which does happen. Where's that process left us? There's currently, as you can see, this is really a table. I don't expect you to take in the details of this table, but it really goes through all the different categories that we have and numbers in those categories and broken down by a taxa. I guess the take-home line is there's 1,843 species listed as of April this year. So, and that list is continually growing. Yeah, that's I guess a reflection of where we're at. And you can see on the right-hand column, these are all the species, all the actual species going through the listing process now. So the TSSC has, and they'll all go through the TSSC, and they'll all have consultation a consultation with states, and it's, as you can see, quite an involved process. And this is where we end up with species listing across Australia. You can see this is really just a heat map showing those numbers. I guess unexpectedly, you can see the higher densities in the more populated areas around, up around that top end Darwin area, but also heavily down the east coast and Tasmania. There's threatened species. They're the areas where the bulk are. No great surprises there. Interesting to see on a map. There's some areas, there's some gaps, big gaps in the middle where there's less, of course, but there's also less work going on out there and far less impacts. So I guess the thread going through all of these talks today is around threatened species monitoring. How do we monitor these things? How do we know what's happening out there? As I've already mentioned, we acknowledge monitoring is not great across the country. It's not just a federal issue. It cuts across all jurisdictions with these species. That really very few species have really well constructed national level monitoring programs. Some species are monitored exceptionally well because there's not many of them and they're in very small areas. Orange-bellied parrots, for example, well, they pretty much know every single one because they all nest in the same spot in Tasmania, and they're all banded and half of them are released. But that's a program that's working really well. But with those, you can monitor reasonably well. But for species like plains wanderers that I showed earlier, spread extensively across large parts of Australia, possibly in areas that we haven't even really monitored, so we don't know the distribution well. So those problems really, filter across. It's difficult to aggregate because people monitor differently, and the system, that the way we monitor varies across areas. So it's really hard to make those decisions of what is, what's abundant, what's not. The department is tackling this through really this is my area, we've set up a long-term monitoring program where we're really trying, and this is focused on all of our NRM investments. We're developing a range of tools to improve long-term monitoring, not just for threatened species, but for on-ground, for ecological monitoring as well. We're targeted at NRM, and our NRM targets include threatened species, particularly through the threatened species strategy. I'm just going to touch on a few of the projects that we've been working on. As I said, we do have a bunch, but some of the key ones that will really inform threatened species monitoring over the next decade really is a big project we have with TURN, so on ecological monitoring standards. This project will have a bunch of modules which really looks at improving data consistency, so it's detailing how monitoring should be done, and it will be rolled out across all of our service providers, which exist across Australia. Through the NRM programs, we work with service providers throughout Australia. So we'll have this standardized monitoring system capturing things like site description and site selection. So really the basics, but also looking at things like vertebrate fauna, invertebrate fauna, recruitment. So this is habitat based. but will really inform and looking at pest fauna species. But another project we're going to be working on with Tern, and we're sort of working through that now, is really tightening up those threatened species monitoring standards. Currently, we have a threatened species action plan, has 100 priority species. We want to work out best practice monitoring for those 100 species and get that codified into the protocols that I showed earlier that Tern are working on. So we can have app-based monitoring, we can have everyone working on the same species doing the same thing across Australia. We will have that data captured in a really controlled way so we can start to actually make better, be informed better about what's happening. We ultimately want this data to be able to move into a centralized database, which for us I'll touch on in the next slide, but moving into threatened species index as well is a key part of that, capturing that data to ensure better monitoring. So really this is the last slide for me. It shows the what we're calling the biodiversity data repository. Capturing all this stuff is important, but unless we can put it in a space where we can get broad access to this information, where we can actually start to capture and store that data, it'd be fair to say we've spent as a department, millions, tens of millions on monitoring over the years. We've lost most of that as a department. It may well be in different databases throughout the states and through various people's laptops, even people's desktop computers, but there's no real easy way to capture and to use that data. So we're working on developing a data capture system. So I guess in summary, that's kind of where the departments, we've acknowledged the problem that threatened species monitoring is not great and that we need to get better at it. And we've acknowledged that we're a major contributor in this space, a data provider, and that we want to start collecting that data better and sharing it and being able to share it so it feeds into the threatened species index. And really the end game of all this is to better understand our interventions on threatened species so we can better target our investments into the future. There's no point us spending money on activities where they're not effective, and without understanding the trajectories in threatened species, it's hard to actually work out what is being effective. So that was really what I was going to talk about today. I'll be handing over now to Dr. Holly Sitters from the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. So Holly, over to you.
Hi everyone. So at first glance, in the middle of this photo, it looks a lot like a road going through some remote bush. But if you look a bit more closely, you'll see that it's actually a very long fence. And use of fencing to create safe havens for threatened species has been a key feature of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy's conservation action. And I'll be talking a little bit about it here today. First, some acknowledgements. So we work across Australia. I'm currently living and working in Ballarat on Wadawurrung country. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we work across Australia and pay my respects to their elders past and present. None of our conservation successes would be possible if it weren't for the incredible generosity of AWC's supporters. I also thank our staff, interns, volunteers and partner organisations who work tirelessly for the benefit of Australia's species. I'm very new to the organisation, so I personally take no credit for any of the great work that I'll be talking about here today. So a brief history to start off with. Our founder, Martin Copley, purchased Crackamire Wildlife Sanctuary in the Perth Hills of southwest WA back in the early 1990s. So Martin had a vision of a new model of conservation with the aim of reversing declines in Australia's species. Crackamire became the first private wildlife conservation reserve in WA, and almost immediately work began on the construction of AWC's first feral predator-proof fence. So Martin and team worked in partnership with the WA government to introduce the Quenda, Woylie and brush-tailed bettong and western ringtail possum inside the fenced area at Crackamire. Several years later, populations of these animals were booming, and so this provided an opportunity for translocation and establishment of these species in newly acquired sanctuaries. However, more vulnerable species like the woylie didn't persist, and so this outcome informed the design of future reintroductions. Today, the AWC is the largest private owner and manager of land for conservation in Australia, protecting species in iconic regions like the Kimberley, the Top End, and Cape York. So together and in partnership, we protect 74% of Australia's terrestrial mammal species, 88% of terrestrial birds, and 54% of reptiles, all across an enormous area of 12.9 million hectares, making this one of the largest private conservation estates in the world. Key partnerships include with the state government in New South Wales in construction of a 9,500 hectare fenced area in the Mallee Cliffs National Park. And at New Haven in Central Australia, AWC became the first NGO to enter into a native title consent determination with Megalia Warlpiri and the Richer traditional owners, recognising native title rights to the sanctuary. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on two key aspects of our work. Firstly, the Ecological Health Monitoring and Evaluation Programme, known as EcoHealth. And secondly, an area where EcoHealth monitoring has highlighted the benefits of fenced safe havens, not only for threatened mammals, but for a lot of other species as well. So ecological monitoring has always underpinned our conservation strategies. Our mission is the conservation of wildlife and their habitat, and to determine whether or not we're successfully achieving our mission, the EcoHealth Monitoring and Evaluation Programme has been developed in order to measure and report on changes in the status and trends in species and threats, as well as ecological processes. So at sanctuaries, focus is placed on species that are likely to be in decline, but whole vertebrate assemblages are also monitored. And so if declines are detected, we implement conservation management actions if the ecological system is already well understood. And if it's not so well understood, then we undertake research in order to address the knowledge gaps and in order to identify the most appropriate conservation management strategies. So the EcoHealth Monitoring Programme is already huge and it's continually expanding. So currently EcoHealth reports are published for 22 sanctuaries every year, as well as EcoHealth scorecards, which provide a summary of the key results. So these 22 sanctuaries are a subset of the total, for which the inventory phase has already been completed, and there's at least 5 years of monitoring data available. There are 30 to 60 ecological indicators per sanctuary, and so these include things like the abundance of an individual species, as well as species diversity. 600 data sets have been collected over the past 5 years when monitoring was fully standardized. And so here a data set corresponds to the abundance of, say, an individual species in a particular year. Since EcoHealth monitoring began, more than 1,000 data sets have been collected. So to illustrate what EcoHealth monitoring looks like in practice, I'm focusing on the Mornington and Marion Downs wildlife sanctuaries and the Tableland Partnership area. So this is the partnership with traditional owners. So these sanctuaries are adjacent to one another, and in total they cover 900,000 hectares. So the vegetation is very diverse because, of course, it's such a large region, but the dominant vegetation type is savanna woodland. So when we select indicators for a particular sanctuary, we consider conceptual models of relationships between species, habitats, and threats. And so at Mornington, Marion Downs, and Tableland, we conduct surveillance monitoring of mammals, reptiles, birds, and frogs, and more targeted surveys of endangered species like the northern quoll. Threats that are currently monitored include the cane toad, which only relatively recently arrived in the region, as well as cats, cattle, and weeds. And we also monitor vegetation structure at a set of permanent sites, and fire is carefully managed and monitored as well. So this all sounds very neat and straightforward from where I sit at my desk, but the reality is that it requires an enormous amount of work. It involves several different survey types, so camera trapping, live trapping, aerial surveys, and call playback. And some of these sites are so remote that they can only be accessed by helicopter. So the northern quoll provides sort of a good example of the value of this sort of intensive monitoring. The northern quoll is one of 4 of Australia's quoll species, and it's the smallest, and it's currently nationally endangered. So key threats include cats, as well as extensive severe bushfires and grazing, both of which reduce shelter. So this is a 10-year data set, and it shows quite a sudden drop in the mean abundance of northern quolls associated with the arrival of the cane toad in this region. Unfortunately, there's no easy solution to this problem, but a working group has been established with the aim of ensuring that current levels of genetic diversity in northern quolls is maintained. So moving away from the Kimberley now and looking more at the effects of predator-free safe havens, eco-health monitoring has shown that the benefits extend far beyond the threatened mammals. For example, ground-active birds like the malleefowl have been found to be more active inside the fence compared to outside. So since the fence was established at Cracker back in the early 90s, fence safe havens have been established at several other sanctuaries across Australia. The fence at Mount Zero Taravale up in Queensland has recently been completed, and northern bettongs will be reintroduced there next March. So introduced predators, foxes and cats, aren't able to access these safe havens, but they are still accessible to native avian and reptilian predators. An example of eco-health monitoring from the Scotia Wildlife Sanctuary further sort of demonstrates the benefits of these safe havens for the whole ecological community. So Scotia is 65,000 hectares and it's in western New South Wales up at the South Australian border. So here the thick white line represents the sanctuary boundary and the blue lines represent two adjacent 4,000 hectare fenced areas. So this Scotia contains undulating dunes and the dominant vegetation type is mallee woodland. All of the threatened mammal species have been absent from this region for more than 100 years. However, they've all now been successfully reintroduced. So the bilby, the numbat, the bridled nail-tail wallaby and the booty or burrowing bettong. So an eco-health monitoring involved surveys of small mammals and reptiles both inside the fence, so at 24 sites inside the fence and at 24 sites outside the fence. So this graph is focused on small mammals. We have small mammal captures on the y-axis and a 10-year time series on the x-axis. Sites inside the fence are represented by the pale shade of grey and sites outside the fence are represented by the darker shade of grey. And so you can see that captures of small mammals were greater inside the fence across the whole time series except for 2011 when they were more similar. 5 species of small mammals were captured, and by far the majority of captures were southern Ningalli and common dunnart. Both of these species were captured 4 times more frequently inside the fence compared to outside the fence. The Bolland's mouse, which is listed as endangered in New South Wales, was also captured more frequently inside the fence, but the difference was a little bit less pronounced. So the fact that this difference was detected in 2008, which was relatively soon after the fencing was completed, suggests that these patterns are a result of top-down processes associated with the removal of cats and foxes, rather than bottom-up processes, which would play out more slowly as vegetation regenerates following removal of goats. Reptile diversity was pretty similar inside the fence and outside the fence. So this is reptile diversity on the y-axis and 3 main vegetation types on the x-axis. And clearly there's no real difference in reptile diversity inside and outside the fence. However, the abundance of reptiles, or the number of captures of reptiles, was lower inside the fence. So this shows the number of captures on the y-axis, again the time series on the x-axis. And so both the total number of captures of reptiles and the number of captures of 32 out of 52 species was higher outside the fence. And this is very likely to be a result of predation by the reintroduced mammals. So for example, the bearded gecko is a nocturnal surface dweller, and so it's vulnerable to predation by foraging mammals. Similar patterns have also been shown in studies of invertebrates. For example, the abundance of termites is found to be lower inside the fence, presumably because they're eaten by numbats, whereas the abundance of beetles is pretty similar either side of the fence. Presumably they're less tasty. So to summarize, To date, 12 threatened mammal species have been successfully reintroduced. Populations in AWC's reintroduction program of species like the marla, the bilby, the numbat, bridle nail-tail wallaby, and burrowing bettong represent quite a significant proportion of the total number of individuals that remain on the planet. Plans for future reintroductions include 2 species that currently aren't represented in any secure area, so the central rock rat and the northern bettong. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the benefits of these safe havens extend beyond threatened mammals, although clearly not everybody benefits. Numbers of reptiles, some reptile species and some invertebrates are smaller or lower inside fenced areas. Some locally extinct mammals have also been reintroduced successfully. For example, North Head in Sydney has been, or 3 species have been reintroduced into North Head. So that's the bush rat, brown antechinus, and eastern pygmy possum. So none of these species are endangered, but all of them used to be part of the North Head ecosystem. In conjunction with reintroductions, AWC ecologists are conducting a whole suite of research and monitoring aimed at not only documenting the outcomes of reintroduction projects, but also a better understanding and building knowledge of threatened species and of the whole ecological communities. And so eco-health monitoring has been crucial to the success of this program. All right, thank you. I will now hand you over to Jeff Hurd.
So thanks again to Holly and also to Ashley, and thanks everyone for coming along. We've had a fantastic turnout, which is really exciting. Today I've set myself 3 tasks. Firstly, I am going to try and convince you that we really need long-term systematic monitoring data for making sound conservation decisions for our threatened species. My second task is to convince you that the Threatened Species Index is a crucial bit of infrastructure for long-term monitoring of species in Australia. And thirdly, I'm going to try to convince you to get involved in the TSX, to contribute data to it, and also to make use of the data sets that we have. So to start with my first task, I've enlisted this beautiful animal. This is the growling grass frog, or southern bell frog. It's a species I've been monitoring now north of Melbourne with colleagues for around about 20 years. And I'm going to try and use the data set that we've collected over that 20 years to convince you that we really do need long-term monitoring data to conserve our threatened species. So I'm going to make 3 points. Firstly, that short-term or fragmented monitoring projects provide us with quite limited insights into population trends of our threatened species, and sometimes even inaccurate. They provide inaccurate information about those trends. So we've been monitoring a large set of sites across northern Melbourne since the 2001 to 2002 breeding season of the frog. And we monitor the number of sites that are occupied. So that's our measure of how the population is going. And this is how it stood in 2001, 2002. We had around 88 sites occupied of our set of 200. If we'd monitored for just the subsequent 5 years, we might have inferred that the population was declining and declining at quite a rapid rate for that short time period. However, if we had started our monitoring not in 2001, 2002, but instead in 2006, 2007, and we'd monitored for the subsequent 4 years, we might have concluded that the species was doing just fine. It was stable or perhaps even increasing in abundance. The truth is that this species has declined very sharply over the last 20 years. So we just repeated our surveys in the last season, in the last summer. And we've discovered that the frog has declined very sharply in the last 5 years or so. And indeed, over the 20 years, it's declined by over 50% in terms of the number of sites that are occupied. So if we'd had these shorter fragmented monitoring programs, we wouldn't have picked up that very substantial decline. My second point with regard to why we need long-term monitoring data to inform our threatened species conservation strategies is that development or management effects can have quite significant lags, meaning that those effects don't become apparent for some years, and we need long-term monitoring to detect them. So my example here is an offsetting program that was conducted in Bundoora, a suburb of northern Melbourne. And this was a wetland, in fact, a chain of wetlands that was created specifically for growling grass frogs. And it was part of an offset for the loss of some quarry habitat. So in the centre of this image is a former bluestone quarry, and it's being filled in this image. That site was really important growling grass frog habitat. But the landholder had permission to fill it under the EPBC Act, as long as he created this offset wetland to sustain, or the idea being that it would sustain the frogs once this habitat was lost. We monitored the site or the area in 2016, 2017, around about 3 years after that infilling was completed. And we found at that time that the frogs were still locally common. We had them in the offset wetland and some of those surrounding wetlands and along the Darrabin Creek as well. So if the monitoring had stopped at that point, which the offset programs so often have short monitoring programs, we might have concluded that the frogs were doing okay and that they had been sustained by this offsetting program and were not significantly impacted by the loss of the habitat. But going back in 21, 22, we discovered that, in fact, the meta population is now entirely extinct. So there was a fairly rapid decline in the quality of the offsetting wetland, and the frog was lost from those surrounding sites as well. And so that indicates that that quarry habitat that was lost really was vital, but there was a lag in the impact of its loss. So another reason why we need to monitor over long time periods. And thirdly, I want to stress that long-term data sets are needed to build models of population dynamics for our threatened species. And they're so often a key tool for prioritising management actions for those species. So again, just in terms of growling grass frogs, this is some work that we did a few years ago, looking at attempting to prioritise where new wetlands should be built in the urban growth areas of Melbourne to sustain the frog. So the green in these maps is a habitat corridor along the Cororoit Creek in Melbourne's northwest. And it is being retained specifically for growling grass frog conservation, as are numerous other corridors around the city. And the grey blobs that you can see in the map on the left are locations where we thought we might be able to build new wetlands for the frogs to offset the loss of habitat outside of the corridor. And then what we did is undertake an optimisation analysis to look at what was the best set of those sites to create for a given budget to sustain the frogs in that landscape. And the map on the right, the highlighted wetlands there are the wetlands that the optimisation selected as being the best to create to sustain metapopulations of this frog. But that was only possible because we had this long-term monitoring data from northern Melbourne. And based upon that, we were able to build a metapopulation model for all the species, a statistical model that predicts where the species will persist and what wetlands the species will be able to colonise based upon their distance to each other. So central to that optimisation was this metapopulation model that was able to predict the metapopulation viability of the frogs under different habitat creation scenarios. And central to that metapopulation model was our long-term monitoring data. So that is my thesis. Basically, in a nutshell, I'm basically saying that without this long-term monitoring data, we are lost, really. We don't know from where we have come in terms of threatened species trajectories, and we can't plan for the future. We can't plan where we want those trajectories to go with management. Okay, so with that argument ringing in your ears, I'm now going to move on to task 2, which is to convince you that the Threatened Species Index is a really vital piece of our infrastructure for long-term monitoring of threatened species in Australia. So what is the TSX? It's a quantitative index that measures changes in the abundance of Australia's threatened and near threatened species, and that's species listed under the EPBC Act or on the IUCN Red List. And fundamentally, it's a database of thousands of monitoring projects for threatened species from right across Australia. I wanted to give you a brief history of the TSX and particularly through this to pay tribute to the previous team, the team that built the TSX. So the TSX was a major research output of the NESP Threatened Species Recovery Hub, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And it was the brainchild of Hugh Possingham, who was the original director of the TSR Hub. The TSX was the product of the tireless work of 3 postdoctoral fellows based at the University of Queensland. So Dr. Elisa Bayraktarov, Dr. Aisha Talik, and Dr. Misha Jackson. And each of that team had really great assistance from BirdLife Australia, so James O'Connor, Glenn Emke, and Joris Dreesen at BirdLife. And also some really great software engineering brilliance from James Watnoff from Plantical. And so there really was a big team effort. And so I really wanted to acknowledge their contribution to creating the TSX. The TSX has had 3 incarnations. It started life as the Threatened Bird Index in 2018, and that was an initiative completed with BirdLife Australia. Mammals were brought in 2019, and plants were brought in 2020. So the index has steadily been adding groups of threatened species. In 2021, the TSX moved to TURN, and it's currently co-funded by TURN and by the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. I'm still getting my head around that new name. And our current objectives are to grow the data set for birds, mammals and plants, and also to add more species groups. So in future, we really hope to add reptiles and amphibians and freshwater fish, etc. And also at the moment, we're building functionality to improve the utility of the index for data providers and users. So today we have data for 283 species. That's greater than 19,000 monitoring time series and over 220,000 surveys. So it's become a really impressive data set on threatened species trends. And as you can see from the map, we've got pretty good coverage of the continent, although there's lots of gaps to fill. How does the TSX work? So I thought I'd run you through the annual trajectory of the index. So we start by putting a call out to data providers right across the country to elicit their monitoring data. And we're doing that right now. We collect that together into our raw database, and that's a confidential database. We then do some data quality checks and move on to some data processing. So we're just about to do this for this year. And through that process, we aggregate data temporally and spatially. And we hold that in an aggregated database that's open access, and you can access that data through our website, which I'll show in a moment. We analyze the data with the Living Planet Index methodology. The LPI methodology is a tried and true approach to producing trends for disparate species and species that are monitored with disparate methods. So have a look into the LPI method. It's a really great approach to producing trends for species that vary greatly in their life history and in survey approaches. We then produce our trends for each of our different groups and subgroups, and we post those to our website. And the trends there are there, as is the raw data for you to interrogate, download, use for whatever purposes you like. So please jump onto our website and have a look. Who uses the TSX and what for? I wanted to give you two case studies, and I'm focusing on the two organisations that have joined us today. So starting with Ashley's department. So recently, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water have brought the TSX into their corporate plan as a key measure of the success of the Commonwealth's investments in threatened species. And I wanted to pay tribute to Ashley and team for this. It's it's a really great move to have this objective data integrated into the corporate plan, against which the department can report the success of their investments in threatened species. As Ashley mentioned, a big program for the department is the Regional Land Partnerships Program. So this is a $500 million investment in national environmental priorities, of which threatened species are, of course, a key component. And we're working with Ashley and team to adapt the TSX to capture the monitoring data that's flowing and will flow through the OLP program. And the reason there is that it's a really significant data stream for us, but also it will enable the NRM bodies that are undertaking work through RLP to assess their management benefit and adapt as required. So this is just an example of the sorts of outputs that you can now get from our data management interface. This is for a species of bird from the scenic rim in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales. And it's a plot of using the LPI method. It's a plot of the population trend through time. And what you can see there is some management response, and then the overriding of that management response through drought and fire. And so we're hoping that this sort of information can be used by our NRM groups to assess how their management is going, but also when it might be overrun by larger environmental events and how they might adapt accordingly. So under RLP, the department will both be a data provider and a data user, and we're hoping that will be true of everyone going forward. And it's true for AWC. So we've seen from Holly some of the fantastic monitoring that AWC is doing across the country. And AWC has been supporting us since our inception, and we now have 24 data sets from AWC in the TSX for some of our most highly threatened mammals. Whilst we've benefited greatly from that data, we've been able also to provide to AWC some plots, some of the analysis of trends of species within their reserves. So you can see here an analysis of the trends of mammals across Australia, and with a breakdown of how those mammals are responding to different management. And you can see that the sorts of approaches that AWC take, which is largely predator-free havens, really do have a very significant positive benefit for those threatened mammals. So AWC can use that to report back to government and also their support base to demonstrate that the work that they are doing is really very successful. So hopefully I've convinced you today to get involved in the TSX. We need you. The data, the index is only as good as the data behind it, and we really want to make the index as accurate as possible. So please get in touch if you have threatened species monitoring data and would like to include it in the index. But hopefully I've also convinced you that you need the TSX, we've got lots to offer to you as well. If you provide data to us, we can analyse it for you, give you back some trends, and you can use that in your reporting. So yeah, please get in touch with us, and yeah, we'll look forward to hearing from you. With that, I will hand back to Beryl. Thanks very much.
Fabulous. Fabulous for all three speakers. That is a really great overview of threatened species monitoring in the country. And we've been getting some great dialogue going in the question and answers. So if you haven't checked that, some of the questions have been answered and we'll get to them. I've got a few. Ashley, actually all panelists, can you turn on your videos? And also we're welcoming Liana Joseph from AWC alongside Holly to assist us there. Thank you, everyone. Ashley, I got from your talk that it's incredibly difficult at a national level to do all this monitoring. What are the strategies, do you think, that you have in the pipeline that are going to be most effective?
I think for us, for the Australian government at least, I've put in the chat link a link to the Threatened Species Action Plan. There's a list of the 100 species that I mentioned. For us, there's 1,800 species. Australian government, it's a collective across all states and territories and NGOs and a whole bunch to do the monitoring. Firstly, Australian government's no one group can do it all. But for us, we've prioritised our species. The next steps, and I think I really mentioned it, will really be to nut out how best to monitor those and to develop the tools to get those data streams flowing. So it goes straight into the TSX ultimately. So we don't have to, Jeff doesn't have to rush around doing data call outs, which I think they're in the process of now. That data flows in so we can track change better. We can track it faster, so we understand our impacts better. And I guess something I didn't mention, the tools we're developing, the intention at least, is to make them freely available. So for any groups or scientists or NGOs who don't have the resources to develop their own systems, they'll be able to use these systems. And as Jeff said, use that data to inform themselves, but it then feeds in at that national level. And I guess this is really just a start, and we would hopefully be sort of building on these. The first 100 we will work on as a sort of almost a proof of concept, but as we move through, we'll work on better capturing as new species are listed and going back to old species. And as the techniques really start to overlap, it'll make more sense what techniques to use. But it'll never be a replacement for on-ground recovery teams and for really strategic views on how to monitor these really widespread species, which will always be a massive challenge.
So the nationally distributed natural resource management groups must be, I know for turn they're important. They must be incredibly important, actually.
They will be a key for us. And so we have these NRM groups across the whole of Australia, so we can they do work across the whole of Australia. So in the future where we have gaps, project gaps, we'll also have that monitoring that they'll do to fill in some of those holes in that map of where species are monitored. So yeah, the regional land partnerships, those regional NRM groups will be key to better understanding what's happening into the future.
I've got a question for Holly and Liana. Take it as you wish. There's a question in the Q&A about how you make the fences suitable for native wildlife movement, but not suitable for pest species. Is that something that you can comment on?
Yeah, Liana has a great deal of expertise on this. I'll pass over to you, Liana.
Thank you, Holly. So mostly they're not permeable to larger native species. The small species can get through, but anything larger than a bilby or a bettong cannot get through. At the moment, people are developing, I think Catherine Mosby and Arid Recovery are working on one-way AI gates, so animals, a little bettong can come up to the gate and be able to get through, or a larger macropod, but at the moment they can't get through.
Great. And can I just ask how long-term monitoring is benefiting AWC?
It's essential to what we do. So we really want to get a sense of what's existing on our sanctuaries or still existing on our sanctuaries after the management that we've been implementing for many years. At the moment, we're really trying to get a sense of what those numbers mean and compare the numbers that we're getting through our monitoring with what we hope the numbers should be. So some kind of evaluation framework for threatened species, for the surveillance species, and for the threats. It is core to what we do. It influences what management we do and how we understand what's happening on our sanctuaries.
Excellent. Jeff, you thought you were going to miss out, but I do have a question for you. Your threatened species index seems to me to be heavily reliant on people who are willing to provide data. Are these the same people that use the data? Is it in their interest to provide it because then they get access to all the tools of the trajectories and so on?
Yeah, that's what we're really hoping to increase, is that utility of the TSX for our data providers. So I suppose initially the TSX was developed to provide these overall trends and as a measure of the trajectories of species right across the continent. But we're moving now to have all this extra functionality, so that and with Ashley's help, so that anyone that provides data to us can then go into the interface, download their data that's been aggregated through our process and cleaned through our process, generate trends for their particular species or their site, or maybe combinations of species within a site, and then use that for assessing how their species are doing and how their management is benefiting those species. So yeah, we really do want it to be a tool, and not just one way where we're going out and asking for data. We recognise that, of course, it's a huge effort to get this data and a lot of expense to get a lot of this data. So we really do want to be able to give back as much as possible. And
a couple of related type questions. Are you getting any from private companies? And while you're answering that one, also be thinking about, how do you get PhD students into threatened species monitoring in a 3-year program? Because there are some questions in the Q&A about what constitutes the right length of time for long-term monitoring. Is it 10? Is it 20, etc.? That seems like 2 questions there.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's any overarching answer to that question about the length of a monitoring period. Ideally, you would monitor until the species is secured, and then periodically thereafter, I suppose. In terms of PhD students, yeah, that's a really tough one. PhD students and postdocs are somewhat of the engine room in the research space on threatened species and generating a lot of this survey and monitoring data, but their projects are inherently short. So I think we need overarching programs to which PhD students and postdocs can contribute. Yeah, the sorts of programs I think Ashley and co are pursuing will be right for that sort of contribution. And then there was a first question. Remind me what that was.
Companies. Do you have
companies? That's right. Yeah. Private individuals. Yeah, we get some great information through from consultants. So yeah, consultants do a lot of work as well in the threatened species space right across Australia. Okay. And a lot of those consultants are quite dedicated to long-term monitoring. And whilst they're pulled in different directions, I suppose a lot of the time, just based upon the work that they need to do, for mining companies and those sorts of situations, they're often brought back to monitor long-term at a particular site. And so they're contributing data to us and some mining companies as well.
That's great. We have got more questions in the Q&A. So what we're going to do is send answers to those that have left their name. Yes, the panel will stay online and divide and we'll make sure that everyone gets an answer to their question. And that's really great. But I think we've had a splendid time together. I can't say morning or afternoon because people are tuning in from all around the world to this, but you'd have to admit it's been very illuminating to hear this. We're all concerned about this topic. And in a couple of months' time, we're actually going to be having almost a bit of a follow-on from this one, Traces of Biodiversity, which will focus on things like acoustics and camera traps and eDNA. And these are all emerging in this area where perhaps we can't see the last of the whatevers, but we might be able to pick up browse lines or something like that of them. So we will discuss that one in September. So once again, thank you everyone for being online today and joining us, and we'll send out a link to the talk so you can follow up. We'll follow all the questions up, and if you have time to do the survey, that would be great. But thank you all. Been a great time together. Thank you.